The night before the operation, I lay there and I thought, because I knew that the way I was, it was dangerous to be under anaesthetic in the first place. But I just looked at it. I was in my late 40s. I'd had a knee replacement. I was having problems with my joints. I ached all over. And I just took all those sort of things into consideration. Lucky enough, I was on the cusp of diabetes. I haven't got any of that now. And it was those sort of things. I just kept thinking, I'm not going to be alive if I don't take this chance. I knew I couldn't do it on my own. I had tried, and I knew I couldn't do it on my own. I needed this. It was my sort of crutch that I needed. But just think long and hard about it.
Leslie, thank you so much for that and for calling. Really appreciate your call. Leslie in Clacton, who's been through the surgery. And, it saved her life, really, hasn't it? And changed her life. Thanks, Leslie. If you'd like to share your story, I would love to hear it. 0800 111 40 41. Maybe you're still in the decision process. Maybe weight has defined your life, throughout your life, one way or another. Do share your stories, and as Leslie says, because Sean Murphy shared it with BBC Essex's podcast Framed, we're talking about it, and that's got to be a good thing, hasn't it? 0800 111 40 41. 23 minutes to 12, a moment of history to bring you. I can tell you now that Rishi Sunak has officially become the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, following his audience with the King. The Buckingham Palace staff have, in the past couple of moments, released a photo of His Majesty King Charles meeting with Rishi Sunak, and now that has happened. It means Rishi Sunak is our new Prime Minister. He'll be leaving the palace shortly, I'm told. He'll be making the short journey into Downing Street, where he will address the nation from the podium outside number 10. We'll bring you that live on BBC Essex.
Everything is wonderful.
And as a result, you may have done that, and Ricky has decided to run away. Then he winked and he said, well, you never know. Ricky may be gay and he's too frightened to come out and tell you.
This was the second problem Sukhdev faced with the police. They didn't think that the name calling and the fight was that important. The officers shrugged it off and then went on to make sweeping stereotypical assumptions about why Ricky hadn't come home. It was now almost 24 hours since Ricky had been missing. Alarmed and distressed about the news that he had been racially attacked, Sukhdev and her family got help from the Monitoring Group, a charity experienced in helping families who are victims of racism and racially motivated hate crimes.
My name is Suresh Grover. I've been working with Sukhdev since 1997, and I've coordinated the Justice for Ricky Reeve campaign, and I work for the Monitoring Group. I'm standing opposite Fenwick and Bentles shopping centre, which is on Wood Street in Kingston. On my right is the bus stop, and it's also the area where the fight and racial abuse took place between the two youths and Ricky's friends, and that's the last time they remember seeing Ricky. We spoke to bus drivers and we looked at paletal bins thinking that he had been injured and still there.
I remember my husband climbing into it to see if Ricky was lying there. And 7 of us forming a human chain to go down into a building which had floorboards missing to see if Ricky was there. We located CCTV cameras in Kingston.
Sukhdev, she actually went to Bentles, and I was with her. We spoke to the security guard, and they said no police officer had come there, and he actually gave us the image. And it's an image of his last moment captured by this CCTV camera as we see it, and then he walks down, and then I remember with my colleagues trying to trace where Ricky's last moments would be. There were only 2 or 3 possibilities. Either he'd come on this Bentle shopping center and turned right, or if he was chased, he would have gone straight. And when you trace that, you would end up a downhill road, and at River Thames. And we met senior police officers at Kingston, and we told him where we think he would be. And you know, the tragedy is, a week later, when we convinced them to do helicopter searches with heat sensors in the river so they could trace a body, they found him within 7 minutes.
On the 21st of October 1997, I was due to meet the press, and the police had come in and they said, "We found Ricky from the bottom of the river." I just collapsed. We got in the car and we came here, home. I didn't want to go in. Because every day I went out. I used to tell my children I was going to bring their brother home. So I didn't have the courage to tell them that I lost Ricky. But as soon as I entered, the door was flung open. Then my daughter just hugged me and said the police officers told her that they have found Ricky at the bottom of the river. They had no right to break this news to my children in my absence.
The children were aged 11, 17 and 21. And although they weren't all minors, Sukhdev felt as their mum, it was her job to tell them about Ricky, not strangers. This was the third encounter Sukhdev had with the police in which her relationship with them further soured. At the time, the police had said that they were worried that the family might hear the news on the radio or the TV and wanted to tell them first. Understandable, perhaps. But then, there was a fourth visit from the police almost immediately after the news that Ricky's body had been found.
The police officer came to my house. He said, "Mrs. Real, I'm sorry about your son, and it's a tragic accident. When we found Ricky, his fry buttons were undone, and he must have gone to the river to urinate and fell in."
Sukhdev told the police that her son had a phobia of open water, and it didn't make sense that he would go near the river to urinate. Sukhdev was now not only having to come to terms with the news that her son was dead, but also with the fact that the police investigating had already made up their minds that this was an accidental death. For Sukhdev and her family, this was the final blow.
I went to see Ricky in the mortuary. I placed my hand on his forehead and I said, "No matter what happens to me, I will get justice for you, my son." And that's a promise that gets me out of bed in the morning.
On the 3rd of November, Ricky was cremated. After scattering her son's ashes in Cornwall, Sukhdev took a bold step against the police officers investigating her son's case.
We made a complaint about the police, and through our solicitors, the police conducted the investigation. Look at Ricky's picture and look at his eyes. I used to call it puppy eyes. It's the last image.
On the 16th of December 1997, the Police Complaints Authority, as it was called then, and now known as the Independent Office of Police Conduct, instructed Surrey Police to launch an investigation into the Metropolitan Police's initial investigation into Ricky's case. I now want to introduce you to Clive Driscoll, a former Detective Chief Inspector with the Metropolitan Police. Now, Clive was never formally involved in Ricky's case, but he was one of the main detectives to finally get a conviction in the Stephen Lawrence case, some 20 years after the black teenager was killed in a racist attack in London. I wanted to find out from Clive where you begin with a case that's over 20 years old, and could he help me?
I would have thought that there was an opportunity around, I read it as a gravelly CCTV.
There were images of two boys in an alleyway, and of course there was an image of an unidentified car in a pedestrianised area very near to where Ricky's body was found. What do you think we can do with that evidence 25 years later?
Just ask the questions, are there new opportunities to enhance anything, any of the forensic opportunities now with today's science.
The original investigators on the case, do you think, even though they're retired now, if we were to go back, they could tell us anything different?
That was one of the first things I did, was always go back and speak to the officers.
Ricky was accompanied by 3 of his friends on the night, and they have not come forward since the original incident.
Without a doubt, they can help. And that's what we want. If you look at Ricky's case, there was an assumption that he'd come home, but he didn't come home. So 6 days were lost. You could say 144 hours were lost. And so that is where it started going wrong.
I start my search. I need to find the now retired Detective Superintendent Bob Moffat, who led the initial investigation. First thing I need to do is go back and find out what evidence he had that convinced him that Ricky's death was accidental. He spoke on the BBC documentary I was in, but the quality's not great. It's a bit crackly, but you can still make out what he says.
Well, the first thing we noticed when we took Ricky's body out of the river was that his fly buttons were undone. A special post-mortem took place, and Dr. Shepherd tells us that he would have had an urge to urinate. The thing you notice about the river's edge is that it is crumbling away. I think it's highly likely that he could have missed his footing and suddenly fell into the river.
Listening to that, it does seem possible that it could have been an accidental death. But there's a lot of assumptions. I need to find Bob Moffat, but I also need to get my head around why the real family still remain convinced that this wasn't an accident and why this is still an open case. Michael Mansfield was the family's barrister at the coroner's inquiry in 1999.
I have very clear memories of tramping the streets of Kingston looking for places where he might have been, CCTV looking at the river banks, and having had that on-the-ground experience and having listened to the family, it seemed to me there was a very strong possibility that this was an attack on him. And the reasons for coming to that conclusion are primarily the fact that, one, he had an aversion to water, so it's unlikely if he wanted to relieve himself he'd go in the river, but having inspected the riverbank, it didn't look at where he was found, which may not mean where he went in. It didn't look slippery, it didn't look crumbly, it didn't look as about to give way that he might have slipped, which was the police view. So that didn't add up either. I think the most compelling aspect of this was an altercation. There was clear evidence that something like that had happened. Another reason why I came to the conclusion this was almost certainly an unlawful killing and an assault was the pathology reports. There are a number of them, but if you read all of them, you put them together, he had been seriously bruised. And of course, you have to remember that this happened in the 1990s. Running in parallel is the Stephen Lawrence case. This was at a time when the police themselves were extraordinarily reluctant to admit that racism existed. And it wasn't until the Lawrence inquiry under Sir William Macpherson that he came to the conclusion that the Metropolitan Police were suffering from a malaise, namely institutional racism. Therefore, when it comes to investigating crime, at that time, there was a reluctance to accept that this might have been a race attack.